Hello, AP. Mr. Salinas here. I wanted to go ahead and spend a little bit of time in expressing one of the main things that I want you to take away from period one. So I wanted to kind of do a lecture here and kind of go into a deep dive on one of the main things that I want you to take away. So that is the Colombian exchange. So bear with me here. We'll go over some of the main things I want you to take away, and then uh, most likely I will make you guys, have some feedback here, possibly do an ed puzzle. So just pay attention here and we'll stop it at certain points. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the Colombian exchange, the effect, it had many. I'm going to zone in and get into a more specific examples so we can kind of understand really the impact that the Colombian exchange had. I'll go back to this slide here just to kind of give you a visual, so we can focus on this. So one of the things I want to point out is that most of the time when we look at history, especially American history, I guess just history in general, you'll notice that the focus is on people, events, and really dates. And dates is probably one of the most least significant when you really look at the history in general. So what's cool about the Colombian exchange is that the focus is more on macro effects. In other words, overarching, um, like an umbrella term. And in doing so, the Colombian exchange really brings in other disciplines like economics, biology, geography, biodiversity. So all of these things really kind of play into the Colombian exchange. And we'll look at that through certain lenses here as we kind of go through this presentation. So let's go ahead and get started. The Colombian exchange, one of its major effects was introduction of livestock. Specifically, let's take a look at the horse. The horse, what we know now, based on anthropology and historical records, mainly anthropology in this case, is that the horse was not so much introduced, but actually was reintroduced into the Americas. Anthropologists and many people within the discipline actually have come to the conclusion that the horse was actually native to the Americas and it went extinct about 10,000 years ago. So obviously it was extinct, so the Spanish actually reintroduced the horse to the Americas and it had a significant impact. What type of things did this actually do? Well, we know that horses changed Native American, especially in the plains region. Some of these impacts included just the way they natives hunted. Specifically, two particular groups were much more successful at really adapting to the horse, and that was the Comanche and the Lakota. Those were the most, I guess, the natives that really adopted the horse in a new way. So, a couple things here. The horse allowed for hunting to be much more effective. I mean, think about just really hunting for the buffalo. I mean, I have an image here to kind of show you that the amount of speed and accuracy increases dramatically. These natives who were nomadic could travel further than ever before, as opposed to being on foot. And so when you have this introduction of the horse and the way they adapt to the horse, it brings in focuses on other items. Society within the Native Americans begin to focus on other things like religion, spirit, being spiritual, and really you see a boom in population, at least in the plains you do. And this is primarily because the food becomes more abundant. No longer do natives need to, try to hunt for their food on foot. They now have that horse. So it's really, in a sense, an innovation in their culture. Again, one of the most successful groups of people were the Comanche, and actually the Comanche were quite significant and present in what today now is Texas, which has a very long history of the horse culture. So that's a huge impact as well. But again, the Comanche and the Lakota will be the most successful at that. So here is one example. If you were to be asked in an SAQ or in a DBQ, or mainly an SAQ, how is it that the Colombian exchange changed the lives of Native Americans? There's a lot of changes, both positive and negative, but this is one that I would, put in the category of a positive in the sense that it made their lives easier. So here's just kind of a little bit more of a dive into an example of how the horse really changed the culture of Native Americans. Now, another area I want to focus on is the produce. And I always like to, in a traditional sense, when we're learning about AP and we're focused on, period one, I always ask my students, what are some of your favorite dishes? What are some of your favorite foods? And I kind of put this aside. And, more popular foods that always come up is pizza, pasta, and all of those really good items that you find. And really in Italian cuisine. Italian cuisine is by far one of the more popular cuisines in the world. And it's interesting that I always shock my students when I let them know that the way we understand the Italian cuisine today would have not happened had it not been for the Colombian exchange. What I mean by that is the tomato is one of the most used ingredient in Italian cuisine. In fact, it's used quite a bit, and tomatoes are not native to Europe. They're not native to Italy. Tomatoes actually come from South America. And so after Columbus establishes or essentially begins the interconnection between Europe, which we call the Old World, and the New World, which is the Americas, you have a swap of imports and exports, if you will. And the tomato is one of the items that actually goes to Europe, and it's utilized. And it's not just the tomato. I mean, there is a whole bunch of produce that actually goes to Europe. The potato, the corn, sunflower, sweet potatoes, strawberries, and so much more. We just don't have the time to, list all of them. But the potato is another one that, really should come to focus. The potato actually has a lot of benefits. For one, the potato today is oftentimes, a synonym with the Irish. The potato is not native again to Europe. It came from South America and it was brought to Ireland. And the benefit of the potato is that it does not require a lot of land. In fact, you can have, 3/4 of an acre or an acre, and you can actually grow potatoes and grow them to survive, to live off on. And that's one of the benefits is that the potato doesn't require, a great amount of land like corn does or other crops. In addition to that, the potato actually produces a lot of calories. So there's a lot of calories. It's calorie rich. So for people that, especially in the turn of the 14th to 15th century and even the 16th century, people worked outside, they did laborious jobs. An increase or a demand for calories was a necessity. So that provided that. The potato also will come into play, historically speaking, during the potato famine. So it's one of the driving or push factors for large immigration to the United States is because, as this picture shows, there is a plague that hits the potato, and therefore the Irish suffer in a significant way. And that, essentially leads to famine, starvation, and it becomes a push factor for many of the Irish to come to the United States. So it is interesting and ironic if you think about it. The potato comes from the Americas, goes to Europe, specifically it's significant in Ireland, and it is because of the potato and the famine, the plague, that will drive Irish immigration in high volume to the Americas. So those are some of other things to consider. So again, produce, by far one of the most significant things in the Colombian exchange. Next, we move into another section here, which is the focus of globalization. one of the things that I think gets overlooked often when you talk about the Colombian exchange is just the fact of how we connected, several continents together. Before the Columbian Exchange, most of trade happened, yes, through the Silk Road, Europe to Asia, and that's predominantly it. The Portuguese were later moving into Africa and established ports, but the Europeans really felt like they were losing out in a lot of trade, and so Columbus really sets the precedent in terms of traveling to the West and runs into a continent that obviously is not Asia; it's a new continent, and so that discovery of a new continent and that new connection really connects the world together for the first time, and it will drive so many historical events from this point. So to kind of zone in and kind of pick a case study, we're going to focus on a city in what today now is in Bolivia, but at the time was in the viceroyalty of Peru, and that's the city of Potosi. Potosi is in, again, at that time in Peru, but today it would be considered Bolivia. Potosi, in its significance, really comes from its richness in silver. In fact, this city or this town will boom, and it's going to boom in the 200,000 range, which is larger than the city of London. And the significance here is that they find a mine that is 50% silver in terms of its deposit, which is significant. So it's considered one of the largest silver mines in the entire world. Okay, and so what Potosi essentially becomes is a driving force in wealth, and it's an example how the Americas, really established one of the first international globalized trading system. And what I mean by that is in Potosi, you have natives who are mining these fields, these mines, and the Spanish are in a way dictating how these are to be mined, and among other things. And what we see is there's a demand for silver in the Asian market, specifically in China. And so what ends up happening is that demand pushes the Spanish to continue to work these mines, which forces natives to work in very severe condition. Now, it wasn't always like that. There were natives that actually were creating a new class, a middle class, where they were essentially providing this commodity to the Spanish. But eventually, that would change. The Spanish would force, their them being superior to the natives, and they would demand this silver and quotas, along with the process and mining it and how dangerous it became. But what essentially happened was that this mine specifically in Potosi, they would take these shipments. In fact, there was one shipment that was actually worth about $139,000 in today's modern currency that was shipped to Manila. Manila's in the Philippines, which is an Asian island. From Manila, they would ship that silver, bullion silver, to China because there was a demand for it in order to acquire Chinese goods. Those goods were then sent to Europe and sold there. So you can see that this, again, Columbian Exchange establishes an international market. And one of the important things to kind of take away, there's a few things, and we'll talk about that, but one of the most important things is that the purity methods, which is the way to determine how rich the silver is and measuring the silver, and we could do a whole class just on that concept. But the methods that Europeans were using were actually inferior and primitive compared to the natives. The natives had a much better system, but because they were, in a social class that was not at the same level of the Europeans, they were not utilized or even considered to be an option. So the Europeans' purity methods, in other words, their methods to try to see how pure the silver was actually quite dangerous when you get into the chemicals of the mixing and everything. And so many Native Americans actually would die from this, from mercury and other chemicals that were very harmful to the body. But again, early on, there was a Native middle class that temporarily was acquiring social class, but soon that it eventually ended. Now, the impact of this Potosi case study is that, again, it establishes a globalized trade network and will eventually lead to other historical events, such as the Seven Years' War, or also known as the French and Indian War. And as we'll find out later in our time period here in our next unit, the French and Indian War really set the stage for what will later become the American Revolution. And again, it all derives from this international market that becomes competitive, and Europeans are trying to race to see who is going to be essentially the ones on top. In addition to that, when we look at one of the impacts of this globalized uh, post Colombian exchange era, is that Potosi is an example of of how we look at Native Americans in general. In other words, it challenges predispositions on that natives were primitive and lesser than Europeans in terms of innovation, and that just isn't true. Not always, anyways. Native Americans actually did have some superior ways of doing things. I mean, they knew how to grow maize. They knew how to grow corn. They knew how to harvest, and they knew how to do all of those things in a very efficient way. And Europeans established this value system and this moral standing that just kind of, uh, I guess, fogged their perception as to natives. And so a lot of the work and a lot of the primary sources that we see of Native Americans really puts them down, really makes them look like they had no idea what they were doing. So this Potosi example kind of gives us a new way of looking at Native Americans. And then the last thing that essentially happens that's impactful is really the Native American European relationship. And that's one of the things that is very important in period one. And that is to understand that Native American European relationships really are this seesaw type of relationship. Europeans need the natives for survival at first. Then they realize the riches that exist in this new continent. And then it's about trying to get margin or trying to get an upper hand on the native people. When you combine that all together, you see a seesaw relationship between Native Americans and Europeans. You know, what will eventually drive this too is just cultural values. For example, Native Americans did not have a concept of ownership. The idea that you could claim land was foreign to them. To them, it was like, how can you claim this lot and say it's yours? It belongs to the earth. Whereas the Europeans, specifically Anglo-Europeans, who were coming from a lot of Northern European countries, ownership was everything. And if you weren't using the land the way you were supposed to, they viewed it as primitive, as something that just wasn't to follow. And so these misconceptions really establish this kind of miscommunication between these two groups, and we see that kind of play out as we move through American history. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better idea in how that becomes, impactful. And again, this all derives from the Columbian Exchange. The last thing I want to talk about, and probably the most significant impact of the Columbian Exchange, is disease. It's an interesting and ironic way to kind of look at it because kind of our situation we are in today, which is we're dealing with the virus. We're dealing with a pandemic on our hands, which is why we're doing and teaching the way we're doing at the moment. But disease is one of those things that really stand out with the Columbian Exchange and have a very significant impact on Native Americans, really as a group of people. Now, in order to talk a little bit about this, I want to go over, virology, which is the study of viruses. We're not going to go into real deep discussion on here, but I want to point some things out that kind of put this into context for you. So just on the bare level, viruses, as we know them today, are basically genetic material. They're surrounded by proteins, and they latch onto cells, they hijack those cells, and then they kind of just spread out, right? And that's how the viruses, in a very general sense, work. Well, to kind of put this into context and understand how disease impacted Native Americans, we got to take a little bit of another case study, if you will. So there is a virus called the HSV1. 90% of American adults actually are carriers of this particular virus. This virus is actually known as the herpes virus. It's called herpes type 1. If you know anybody that has a cold sore, that's actually what it is. The HSV1 is basically a cold sore. But again, 90% of American adults are carriers of this. And this type of virus is actually would be categorized as a very low virulence, as in a biological sense, which really means a very low potency. Like it doesn't really affect us very severely. So it's not high mortality. And part of that reason is because we have exposure. Today during the coronavirus, one of the things that we talk about is exposure. You have two camps, one saying that no, exposure is not a possibility, and exposure just simply means that we've built some type of immunity to it. But in this case, the HSV1, we have, a very significant exposure to it. So in other words, the HSV1 virus, we have exposure to it and it has exposure to us. So therefore, it has a very low potency to it. On the other hand, viruses that have high virulence is actually the ones that we call species to species. This would be like birds to human, which is more of a form of an influenza, or the bird flu. These have very high virulence, actually, very high potency. And that type of potency can harm what they call a virgin population. In other words, a population has never been exposed to these types of diseases. Disease is not only, when we look at disease through the Colombian Exchange, is really not only just how it wiped out Native Americans. What it is what brings the effect of it, which is slavery. And that's a very important topic we'll talk in American history. And again, the virus and the disease that we'll talk about really drives slavery and close extinction of Native Americans. So one of the best ways I can try to compare this, or give an analogy, is taking a more modern example. So if you remember back in CWS, for those that had me or just had CWS, one of the units we learned at is Oceania. In Oceania, we learned about Australia and its history. And one of the things that we learned in Australia, at least when you were in my class, I taught you that one of the biggest issues Australia had was a rabbit problem. What I mean by that is that rabbits are not native to Australia. And some individual decided to bring rabbits in. The way the story goes is that he really just wanted to shoot them in his backyard. But as we all know, rabbits reproduce often and in large numbers. And so because the rabbits weren't native to Australia, they had actually no predator. So their population just exploded. In fact, it got so bad that the Australian rabbit population reached 500 million rabbits, which was just significant and tremendous in a very bad way for Australian biodiversity. The rabbits were eating up all the produce. They were destroying all the farmland. And if you know anything about Australia's geography, is the outback, which they have a huge desert due to some geographic features. Australia already has little fertile land as it is, and the rabbits were eating that up. So one of the things that they tried to do was actually build this fence. And actually, there's a famous movie called The Rabbit-Proof Fence. Again, I showed that in CWS class. It's about this fence where they try to keep up. If you follow my cursor here, they actually try to keep the rabbits on one side of the fence in order to save a lot of the produce. Australia, when you look at geographically, A lot of the fertile land is around the coast. In fact, most people live on the coast because the majority of Australia is a desert. But in any case, they built this fence to try to keep the rabbits on one side, but it didn't work. So Australia had to come up with a different solution. And what they decided to do was actually introduce a virus, a very deadly virus to this rabbit population. The virus was called Myxoma virus. It was extremely potent. The virulence on this was very high. And they essentially let it go out among the rabbit population. The rabbit population decreased from 500 million to 100 million. That was significant, right? I mean, you're talking about 400 million just wiped out. Okay, so this potency of virus was effective because that rabbit population had lived there for so long, and it had no. It's what we call a native population or a virgin population that had no exposure to the virus, and it wiped them out. The reason I bring this up is because that rabbit population is a perfect analogy for Native Americans. That's what happened. Native Americans had no immunities. They were a virgin population, and the reason that they were affected so much was because they also did not domesticate their animals. They had no real livestock. And as I said before, one of the most dangerous types of viruses with high potency are species to species transmission. Well, Europeans had domesticated pigs, sheep, cattle, and so on. And they had exposure to it, just like we Americans have exposure to the HSV1 virus. So it wasn't a factor for them. So when the Colombian Exchange essentially brought over all of these produce, this livestock, the Native Americans stood no chance. So when Europeans in the Americas wanted labor, they wanted people to work, Native Americans, besides them running away because they knew the land, they were also wiped out. And that is a perfect example of some of the effects of the Colombian Exchange. So I'm hoping that these examples really kind of give you a better idea in how significant the Colombian Exchange was. Again, all the way from bringing new foods to Europe to feeding a country like Ireland, and then also putting them into a famine because of how reliant they were, all the way to how impactful disease, close to wiping out an entire population. So again, I'm hoping that this gives you an idea, and hopefully in an SAQ you can reference some of this content to kind of, fulfill those particular answers on the SAQ or whatever essay question you may be asked. So hopefully you guys learned something today, and hopefully that going forward we can continue to, have better examples to prep you for this college board exam. All right, thank you guys.